This is The Limits of Our Language, a podcast about digital writing across the curriculum for teachers who believe in the need for development of multiliteracies inside and outside of the classroom. I'm Darcy Flansburgh. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today I am here with Sophia Ulhaq, who is coming all the way from the UK. And she has a background in English as a second language in terms of teaching at various levels. So we're going to hear a little bit about how she uses writing with students who are still learning English as a language. Sophia, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I've been teaching English as a second language for about almost 5 years now. And I've taught in the UK and in China. Currently, I'm in the UK. And I've also taught from every level, from complete beginners who are just learning a bit of vocab through to students at university who are learning how to write dissertations.
Wow. Yeah. Cool. So in terms of how did you come into what made you want to teach this particular subject?
The selfish answer is that I wanted to travel. The proper answer is that I do find English quite fascinating, and as someone who is bicultural, who grew up in a bilingual household, I've always found it interesting how, well, the limits of language essentially. I find it interesting that not having the ability to communicate both transactionally and interactionally is a real barrier for people. And English, being as prevalent as it is in the world, is a solid language to be teaching. I've always had an interest in teaching as well. I've been tutoring and, joining those clubs where you teach students that are younger than you since high school. So it kind of just progressed from there. I figured ESL was interesting. I'd get to travel, I'd get to meet people from different backgrounds, and I'd get to help them communicate in the language that they want to communicate in.
Yeah, so you were here in China for a couple of years, and you were teaching at the college level?
Yeah, I was in China for 2 years. The first year I taught a variety of different English subjects, which included that dissertation writing course. And I also taught creative writing to people who spoke English as a second language, various different English majors or translation majors. It was all university level. And in my second year, it was the same university level, but I actually taught on a joint program. So that's basically a collaboration between a UK university and a Chinese university. And that was very much EAP, which is English for academic purposes.
Right.
And that was helping students who were essentially engineering majors. But they were learning their degree in English in order to get like a dual bachelor's from the Chinese university and the UK university. And they needed a lot of support in English in order to study that degree in English. So I taught academic English, which included a lot of writing. Right.
Yeah. So what kind of writing were you asking them to do for those classes?
So it was... So there's always the writing where, you need to have decent grammar and, punctuation and all those things. But academic writing is really about the thought process. When you think about how we write in, the West, I suppose, how journal articles are largely written in English, there is a certain level of discourse that is expected. Things like using the passive voice, things like how do you present evidence, how do you keep biases out of your writing. And these are very subtle things. They're things that we kind of learn through the education system when you're fluent, and you kind of learn it by doing essays in high school and building your way up through college and university. But with them, they were having to learn not only how do I use the right words, but what is academia in English as opposed to in their native language.
Right.
And that was very difficult. Covering things like plagiarism, covering how to paraphrase things accurately. These were huge things that needed to be overcome. and cultural things as well. There is a tendency in Chinese, for example, to kind of put your point at the end of a paragraph. Like you kind of work your way up to a point. Whereas in English, you have things like topic sentences. You kind of need to clarify from the beginning what you're talking about, then provide your supporting evidence for what you're saying, and just getting around that cultural block as well,
right.
as well as just the language side of things. There's a lot to cover, and it's quite heavy, and there's often a lot of pressure as well because students are kind of doing their degree alongside it, and it can get quite heavy in terms of the writing workload.
Right. And I've also found in China that my students, which was totally the opposite from my experience when I taught in California, the students want to learn grammar. They want to know what's grammatically correct. Did you have that experience?
I think I have that experience with most of my students.
Yeah.
You get the odd students who've gained a certain level of confidence in their fluency. Usually they're students who consume a lot of Western media, students who watch a lot of Hollywood movies and things like that, or listen to a lot of music from the West. They're a lot more confident with making mistakes.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of students that I speak to, a lot of the times they're more concerned about the grammatical errors they're making than these kind of larger features of rhetoric within writing.
Right.
And so, yeah, I've definitely noticed that within Chinese students, and I think generally students from the Far East, there is this idea of perfectionism. They're very afraid to be incorrect in things, and they tend to get more embarrassed. Whereas if you have Italian students or Spanish students, they don't care. They're fine with that. They just want to express themselves.
Right.
So within ESL, often you have multilingual classes. So you have all these cultures and you have these very different approaches to education clashing.
Yes.
So when you have someone from a bit of a rote learning background, who's used to kind of the teacher telling them what to write or how to write, compared to a student from a background where it's more communicative learning, and they're ready to express themselves. It's very different types of teaching, very different types of with one student you're trying to restrain them a little bit, with the others you're trying to encourage them to be a bit more free with how they write and how they express themselves.
That it's difficult to teach style, and rhetorical style, as you mentioned. It's challenging because some students, they look at what are the rules, and I'm just answering the question, and it's like, well, but you also need to show a voice. There needs to be a presence there. And I know that goes further down the line, and I'm sure that when you're teaching engineering students, that's a little bit more challenging because they're just trying to get their point across and move on, right?
Yeah. I mean, with engineering students, the interesting thing was the types of writing that we were trying to push them to learn. So it wasn't necessarily, an essay analyzing Shakespeare. However, there were still clear things that we needed to get through to them. So, for example, process writing. How do you describe a process? How do you give clear instructions for something?
Yes.
The idea of using language that isn't emotional. So there's a tendency to overuse adjectives and verbs, whereas compound nouns were kind of what I was looking for. And there's this it's interesting because you don't know it until you read it. So you read a student's work and they're using kind of very flowy language. They're trying to use really expressive ways of describing something, and it's like, well, this isn't a formal piece of writing very dryly telling me how you would use this particular machine or how you would fix this particular mechanical object. This is telling you to believe in yourself and things like that. And you realize this because there's almost, in their native language, there's more of a romantic maybe flow in how things are written.
Yes.
There tends to be more expression in how things are written. And the dry academic stuff, even in Chinese academia, isn't the norm. And you realize that that's actually, I'm having to push you into a very uncomfortable space, not only from a linguistic perspective, but just from a cultural perspective, what you're having to learn. And so they have to try and find ways to describe processes, to describe, rather than argumentative essays, they would more have to do problem solution type essays, you know, and describing an issue without, I suppose, making it seem like too much of an issue was quite difficult. The language they would use would things like saying something is a big problem, whereas you'd really just want them to say the issue is.
Yes.
Things like using there was a lot of like the passive voice. This was something that was very difficult and is very difficult for a lot of students to wrap their heads around. The idea that it doesn't matter who the doer of the action is, the action itself and what is being done is what matters. And you have to kind of separate yourself in academia from the topic at hand. And this was something that was very difficult. It is very difficult for students to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, definitely. And interesting, the process writing and technical writing are also a totally, you know, different area and genre that I've only slightly experienced myself, just, you know, because it doesn't come up a lot in high school writing. But one thing I like to have my students do is they make a Lego structure, and then they have to explain in writing how to put together that structure. And then they take it apart and they put the pieces into a cup with their instructions, and then they have to give it to another student to put those pieces together. And it inevitably ends up just ridiculous, but it's just an activity to show them like how explaining how to do something requires a lot of technical language and a lot of skill in terms of how all the little nuanced language to explain how to put those pieces together. And there's another one that I know some teachers do in America where they're explaining how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and it's always, you know, it's just a fun little activity, but it always invariably shows students like how much they're not explaining in terms of how to do something.
Adults love that kind of stuff to do. So we did something similar with paper airplanes. So you had to make the best paper airplane that would fly the furthest and then write down the instructions to make it. So they both got the activity where they got to get in groups and make it, and the classroom was a mess. But then they had to sit down and write, and it was like fold from right to left. And the way instructions are written in their native language is so different to the way they're written in English. And they're having to overcome so many little issues. And those types of exercises where you show the gap in their knowledge so that they understand that there is a gap and they need to address that gap. Those are very empowering for students. We did another one, particularly as these were engineering students. We did one where we gave them some select materials and they had to go make a bridge. And this bridge had the one requirement that if I put a ping pong ball at one end, it would speed and go down to the other end, past like this band, basically. So they had to think about speed, they had to think about the height of the bridge, all those things. And they had to build it and do a whole project and do a poster around it. And it was this long-term 1-week project. And so many of them got into it. They were filming it. They were doing like little background film for us to see how they came up with the process, what their solution was. They had to write the instructions on the poster, but also then in speaking, explain the process of making it. And it showed that there was something tangible to do, and then your instructions are what are needed to do it. And stuff like that's really fun. I think it's very engaging for students. It's real world to an extent, application of what we're trying to show them.
Right. Yeah, those are great. I mean, those are just like, again, just showing writing in a different form, like, and that's like as a means to communicate, you know, like how do you tell someone how to do something? And because a lot of times students just think, oh, it's just this formal activity that I have to do in my literature class or whatever, and it becomes a hands-on experience. So those are always fun. But now you're back in the UK and you're teaching English at a different capacity. You want to explain a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, so I've gone to the other end of the spectrum. So now I teach refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. I teach them what we call in the UK ESOL. And ESOL is English for Speakers of Other Languages. It's basically British ESL, but the sort of, I suppose there's a national curriculum for it. And the objective really with ESOL is to help people who plan to live in the UK indefinitely. And it's a language that is often transactional. So it's language like going to the doctors, getting a haircut, buying tickets for the bus. It's very it's a functional language that they need in order to integrate and assimilate within the UK. So that's what I do, basically. A lot of my students, come from quite difficult situations, as you can imagine. Most of mine are refugees and asylum seekers. And the English I focus on, they're quite low level. The lowest level can't put a sentence together, and the highest level can talk quite basically, like they can do basic communication. They probably won't be able to describe too much of what they're feeling or what they want beyond transactional stuff. The way I would kind of say it is that the ones at the lowest level, if you call them on the phone, they'll panic a little bit and might put the phone down on you. But the ones at the highest level will have a conversation with you and agree to meet you at X time and X place for the class. So that's kind of the level we're looking at. And it is very different, as you can imagine. It's very different. They're not looking to write essays. They're not looking to... Writing actually isn't seen as that important of a skill beyond writing to fill in a form, maybe a form that a doctor would give you. So writing your name, your address, your date of birth, these things are important. But in terms of writing for expression, writing how your week went, these things are often seen as a little less important. Speaking is the production activity that is seen as more important.
Right.
And that's just generally within ESL. I don't necessarily believe that, but within ESL and ESOL, speaking is king, speaking and listening. Because if they're able to verbally communicate, that obviously puts them at a much more confident place, a much more advantageous place to start living their lives and integrating into the country.
Sure. So, but even in speaking, do they maybe have to write something down to prepare them to speak, or is it something that they're given and then they're practicing speaking? Is there ever like a writing component that's just the composing of what they're going to say?
At the levels that I'm currently teaching, there is less so, for a number of reasons. One is we attempt to build fluency. So fluency over accuracy is kind of the mantra we go by, in that we're okay with them making grammatical mistakes so long as they speak kind of quickly, with confidence, with pronunciation, rather than one-word answers. And too much of a build-up, too much of a prep stage can sometimes lead to overthinking in terms of accuracy. So most of the teaching is to do with lexical chunks, which is when you teach fixed expressions, like, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? It's almost like, there's a word for it and I've already forgotten, but it's almost like there was like a whole phase in, I think, the 70s where, you'd kind of do a sing-song with students where the teacher would say one phrase and the students would repeat. It's kind of like that, but it's not as rote. But you teach in chunks. You teach the language, you hope they learn it, and they're fluent. So there's less of a preparation stage because of that. The other reason there's less of a preparation stage is because there are a lot of barriers to that. So, for example, getting them to write down a few words to prepare a speech, like my lowest levels won't be able to do that at all. My highest levels are probably ready to start doing that. Because you're thinking about, they need to look down, they need to write something in order to prepare for speaking, and that writing might be difficult for them. Things like, especially if they come from a language that is, maybe like Arabic, for example, where they've had to actually learn a whole new script. Learning speaking is so much faster. Their speaking is so much further ahead than their writing. And because a lot of them come from rote learning cultures, they tend to memorize things very well. So if I tell them, like, oh, you need to draft out what you're going to say, they usually won't. They'll just say, well, no, I know what I want to say in my head. Writing it out will take ages, and then I won't even read it when I'm saying it because I already know what I want to say.
Okay.
So it's longer pieces of writing that they might do that. And one of the things I do have to try and do, because I'm trying to prepare them essentially to go to what we in the UK called a vocational college. I'm basically trying to prep them. They've come fresh to me, you know, from their countries. I prep them just enough so that they can go to vocational college in order to gain more qualifications. Eventually, we want them to get up to a high school level. And so they stay with me, and they do have to learn some, I don't know, I suppose student skills, you know, classroom skills, things like writing the date at the top of their notebooks, things like having notebooks. So it becomes something where I do want to do more writing, but I have to look at what's comfortable for everyone that I'm with. And often they'll be like, I don't know how to talk to my doctor. And that matters more to them than the writing, which of course makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Well, is there, I mean, and I know that you've had various experiences in terms of teaching ESL, and you are a writer yourself. You have a very funny blog, which I greatly enjoy, called The Lazy Slinky.
Thank you.
Is there any type of writing that you would like to teach, like if at this job or somewhere else?
Well, everything I've told you up to this point, I've been ignoring, quite frankly, because I think writing is great for students. I think they worry too much about accuracy. They worry too much about spelling. But what this lockdown has given me in the UK is I teach distance, and many of my learners don't have an internet connection, so none of the Zoom teaching. What I do is I create work packs for them, and we have these work packs delivered to them. And in them, I will give them some vocab for feelings, for example. Then I give them a choose the right spelling exercise, and they have to choose the right spelling for the feeling. And I'm like, right, okay, now choose 3 of these and write sentences. Tell me how you felt last week. And that is something where they understand that the point is to talk about the feeling, and they're able to write about themselves. And because we're not doing many of the spoken classes right now, we can actually focus on writing. And what I like to do is focus on effective engagement, because it was like you said, writing is practice to learn. And I personally, when I learn a language, I like having writing exercises, because it's unlike speaking, there's not pressure to get it done immediately. You can kind of think about it. You can think about word order. You can think about punctuation even. You can think about spelling. You can think about all these extra things that usually fall by the wayside. And what I would like to do more of is have more of these activities where they write their feelings down, especially for refugees and asylum seekers. I think they focus so much on knowing everything so they can just live their lives, that sometimes you need to have a class where you sit and you just talk about your feelings. And so I've taught them things like culture shock, and then I asked them to write down an example of, when did you feel culture shock? What happened? And they can just get like 2 sentences out sometimes, 1 sentence, sometimes a paragraph. It depends on the level. And they're able to engage with it, because it's not me telling them to write about anything other than themselves. Sometimes it's as simple as them writing about their family, or writing about things that they like about the UK, things that they don't like about the UK as well, like empowering them to have their opinions and have their thoughts. So this is kind of what I would like to do more of. Maybe like diary keeping would be quite useful. Great for practicing the past tense as well. It could be like goal setting, planning for the future. All things that are useful for their particular context, but also things that empower them to use language and relate it to their own experience. And down the line, maybe, I have done a little bit of this in the past, but I think creative writing as well. I've done some interesting activities where, students look at a panel of like a comic strip with loads of different pictures, and they have to talk together. So it's a communication activity to order the strips into what they think is the story. And then it's always fun to get them to write the story. And they're able then to communicate, they're able then to speak and write and craft a narrative. And I think what that does is it shifts the focus away from grammar and perfection and to what I want to try and say. I want to try to get the story out. I want to try to talk about my life. I want to try and do this. And that shift of focus really helps, because then you're not too worried about accuracy. You are focusing on fluency, but fluency in writing rather than speaking.
Right. Yeah, that's great. It reminds me of, I like to do this thing. I have my students write a bilingual book entry, because I gather all of these stories and I put them into a book at the end of the year. And having taught ELL students my entire career as a teacher, Spanish ELL students in California and now Chinese ELL students in China, I asked them to write about like first learning another language. And I always show them this example. David Sedaris has a hilarious essay about learning French. It's called Me Talk Pretty One Day. And it's hilarious just because it's David Sedaris. So, I mean, it's one of my favorite essays to show them, and they just always crack up at how wrong he gets the language. I mean, how but he refuses to give up. And even by the end, he doesn't really know French that well, but he's refusing to give up because he's determined to be fluent. And so I have them write about their own experiences learning a language. And it could be learning English. It could be learning another language. Some of them, especially in China, know multiple languages. And it's just an experience for them to have fun with writing and really talk about their experiences and process those experiences, because sometimes we look at writing as like, it has to be this thing separate from myself. I'm just doing it for school. And it's like, but what if it's something that really helps me better understand myself, And that journaling.
I think people overthink it.
Yeah.
Like you're totally right. People overthink it. They think that in order to write, you have to write really well. But what you said about writing being practicing to learn, I think that's such an important point to make. I think we should always encourage people to express themselves in writing and not worry too much about whether they have the best vocabulary, whether they're saying things in the best way, because you can always redraft, but to actually write, to get it out there, to use writing as a process to get better at something. I mean, you mentioned my blog. It's one of the things I try to do on my blog, is just write what I think, write my feelings, and not worry too much about the perfection side of things. And it's something I always push my students to, in the same way that you're saying, is just they will hesitate so much to write because they think, oh, well, it's going to get marked. And I'm like, well, I won't even mark it if you don't want me to. Do you want me to tell you how to improve it? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, well, that's what marking is. But, they get worried. They're like, oh, you're going to mark it. You're going to tick it and cross it. And, things like that. And they get really worried about the grammar. And I was like, okay, you know what I'll do? I will just underline your mistakes. I won't even tell you what the mistake is. I'm just going to underline it. You figure it out. And that actually worked, because they were like, oh, okay. So then I would underline and maybe write WW, which is wrong word, or underline and write a T. And then at the end, I'll give them feedback on the content. I'll say, well, this is really clever what you did in this paragraph. I really like that you used paragraphs, which doesn't always happen. Your ideas are clear, your ending is clear. I would maybe just, not make new points in the conclusion. Done.
Yeah.
And so then they have the language feedback that they were so worried about, but they have the power to change that. And then they have the kind of extra stuff, like the stuff that their content stuff, that's what teachers writing the notes about. That's what teachers looking at. And it shifts their focus again.
Yeah.
And they're able to use it.
Yeah. When I started teaching, I would, as we say in English literature, I'd make the page bleed with my red marks. It was just like covered.
Oh.
It was terrible. And I think back to it, I'm like, that was so pointless. It was a waste of my time and theirs, because I was just covering these pages in comments and corrections that really they didn't fully understand. And I do something similar to what you're talking about now, and I just put a check mark like next to the paragraph, and that means that they need to look at this paragraph. Like, look at this paragraph again, and I'll circle, for a wrong word, I'll circle an area and just like, okay, look at this, and have them have the agency and autonomy to look at their own work and think, okay, how can I fix this? As opposed to me saying, here, you should write it like this. And which is what I was doing when I first started, and I just think it's so terrible. It's like I'm telling you how to write as opposed to letting you figure out how you want to write, and that's what I think a lot of non-English teachers, when they look at writing, they're like, I don't want to have to do all that. And it's like, you shouldn't be doing all of that. You should be letting them write and make sure that they're getting the point across. Are they answering the essay prompt? Are they doing the basics of your rubric? If they are, move on. Because like I've seen some like history teachers in particular who will take so much time to correct the grammar on an essay, and I'm like, that's not even one of your academic standards. You don't need to do that, right? Like, are they making
What's
points?
Interesting is I taught history once. And my history students came up to me and they said, we don't really want you to correct our English, because I had corrected their English, and I was like, what, you don't? And they're like, no, we just want you to, like, are we making a good argument? And I was just like, okay, fine. And because I had the choice of making the criteria, and I was like, okay, you know what? Yeah, the criteria, 5% of your marks are your language. The rest is all going to be your arguments and whether you're making them. And they were so happy that they had control over that. They were able to come to me and say that. And I think one of the greatest fallacies that we have as teachers is students are worrying about every mistake that they've made. They're worrying about being wrong at everything. And teachers are worried about not catching the mistakes.
Yeah.
Because if we don't catch the mistakes, that must mean we don't know our subject. And I think those two ideas butt heads, and you end up with students freaking out, you end up with teachers freaking out, and the actual point of all of this gets missed. So I know this whole thing. I had a great professional development workshop when I first taught EAP in Wales. And the lady there, she actually gave us examples of what you're saying. So she had like photocopied past examples of marking, and one had all the red ink and the other had very little stuff on it. And they're like, if you were a student, which one would make you panic and not want to touch it? And which one is going to make you look at the mistakes? And we're like, okay, the one where there's fewer mistakes. And they were like, yeah, but it's the same number of mistakes. It's just the marking, the feedback focuses on what can be done to improve it, whereas the first one focused more on what's wrong with it.
Right. Yeah.
And as a teacher, you are a facilitator of learning. And as a student, your job is to learn, figure out how you learn and how you improve. Your teacher is just there to support you through it. And like you said, with writing, other teachers, I think a lot of teachers freak out thinking they need to correct every word, correct every bit of punctuation. But it's okay if they're missing that stuff. What's the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg? That's what you actually need to focus on, because all the bigger stuff below the tip, the student's going to figure that out on their own over time. You can't teach everything.
And it's also like, I like to have students, I have them write several drafts of their essays, and I like to have them, once they turn in a draft, I give them the rubric, and I tell them to look at the rubric and look at their draft and ask themselves, did you do these things? And looking at it and ask them like specific questions, like, does your thesis have an arguable claim? And just those simple questions that they can then reflect on their own writing before it ever goes to any kind of grade or what have you. And most of the time, for me, I don't give them an actual grade until it's like, okay, it's a final draft and we're moving on. And like up until that point, I'm just providing feedback, And the feedback, again, you don't have to be a grammarian to give them feedback. You can literally just look at your content, and this goes into standards-based grading, which is a whole other topic that I could get into. But you just look at your content, and what do you want them to learn with this piece of writing, right? Okay, did they do that? Okay, move on, right? Don't get stuck on the nitty-gritty. But it just...
A great thing as well is peer assessment. So you give the rubric, but you get them to swap papers.
Yes.
And then they're looking at a friend's work instead of their own work, so they're not making excuses for themselves. And you can see the little gears turning as they learn how to apply. I've done this in my exam classes, so I've taught IELTS exam stuff as well, and it's the same with the essays. There is like they overthink so much. They use these fixed phrases that are making no sense, but because they know they can score points with it, they do it, but it doesn't actually help them be better writers.
Right.
And so you show them this rubric, and they're able to kind of be like, oh, okay, am I doing that? I'm not doing that. Another thing, you were talking about multiple drafts. I like doing drafts, and I like having each draft have a goal. So in the first draft, are you making a sound argument?
Right.
Then in the second draft, so like the first draft is like structure. Are you structuring your argument well? And then the second draft is like, okay, within each paragraph, are you making your points clearly? Are you linking the paragraphs? Is there a cohesive element to it? So like organization, cohesion. And then at the end, okay, let's look at your grammar now. And I can give them grammar feedback. And it does mean looking at the same essay 3 times.
Yes.
But it forces them to continue improving. And then because I get them to staple together all of the work. When you look at the first essay and you look at that third essay, it's like, oh my God, this level of improvement that they can see is happening just by focusing on the right things at the right time, instead of just trying to be this perfect grammarian, this person who has perfect grammar, excellent vocab, and they're writing some big magnum opus. They're able to just focus on the utilitarian aspects of what they need to do.
Yeah, and it's also culturally, like my Chinese students, the first time that they have me, they feel like when they're turning in writing, it has to be perfect, and I'm like, no. Like, you need to understand with me that I just want to see what you can do. Well, this is just a let's see what you got, and then once I see what I'm working with, then we can start shaping and working and being creative with your writing together, and a lot of students are like, well, I don't know, where to start. So I give them sentence stems and I say, use these, and then they'll usually use them to start with, and eventually they start finding their own voice. But again, it's about the practicing of it and giving them time to do it, as opposed to, I did that essay this one time in the middle of the year and then I haven't done anything since. And that's why it's like, I talked about this in our first episode with Habib about like not needing to grade the writing. Sometimes it's just a reflective writing activity, and it's just meant to reflect on, like journaling, like you're talking about. It doesn't need to be graded. It's just a reflective activity to process your ideas and your emotions, and then you move on to the next activity. But yeah, there's so many ways that we can go about writing, and I'm sure we could go on and on. But I'm gonna let you go. I know it's late in the UK now. But thank you so much for all of your insight. I think there's a lot of really good ideas there. And hopefully we can have another interview again, maybe on a different writing topic, because I know that you and I could talk about writing for a long time.
Yes, definitely. I think thank you so much for having me. I mean, creative writing is one. Exam writing, that's always great, because students feel so pressured to get it done for an examiner rather than for themselves. It's always great to, there's writing in so many forms, and I think loosening the bolts a little bit and allowing a bit more freedom to make mistakes, I think, is the one thing I would recommend to any student, and for any teacher who's got students who are nervous about writing. Just say you won't even mark it. Say you'll just underline a few things, and you'll see your students get so much more relaxed with it. Yeah, definitely. Great advice. Well, thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye. This has been The Limits of Our Language. Join us next time for more ideas about how to bring writing to learn into your classroom. See you then.